It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. Afghanistan has suffered one of its worst attacks in over 15 years of war. A truck bombing in the capital Kabul on Wednesday killed over 100 people and wounded at least 460. This comes days before multi-nation peace talks on Afghanistan are set to begin. The explosion could derail those talks as the Afghan government blames the Haqqani wing of the Taliban. It's also set off public anger. On Friday, thousands of protesters held a rally calling on the government to improve security. But at least 4 people were killed when police opened fire. Patrick Cockburn is a longtime Middle East correspondent for the newspaper The Independent. Patrick, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. So if you could talk about this attack and the context in which it occurred.
Yeah, the attack was right in the heart of Kabul. It was just on the edge of the diplomatic zone there, where all the embassies are situated. It's the vehicle, which seems to have been a sewage tanker, was packed with explosives. So there was this enormous crater afterwards. And you have to visualize, the streets in Kabul are full of people. People basically get anywhere by walking. So when a bomb go off like that in the middle of the street, you're going to kill an awful lot of people, and they did. So, but even by Kabul and Afghan standards, this is pretty devastating.
And in terms of who carried it out, the Taliban has denied responsibility, even though the Afghan government has blamed it for the attack. ISIS has been silent so far, at least as I understand it. Who do you think carried it out?
Well, the answer is, one doesn't know. It's interesting that the Taliban denied it. They probably have an interest in doing so because of the heavy civilian casualties. It might be the Haqqani network. It might be Islamic State. The problem is, this has become almost a traditional method of warfare not just in Kabul, but in Baghdad, in Manchester, in England, of the perpetrators know that you can have a devastating impact on world opinion by, one fanatical person prepared to get killed driving a vehicle full of explosives. And it's pretty impossible to stop because the target is civilians. It's the entire civilian population. And security isn't that good in Kabul when I've been there. But even where security is good, as may have happened when this bomb went off, that the vehicle can't get through a checkpoint, the guy just blows himself up. This is what happens in Baghdad all the time. And often there are a lot of people waiting at that checkpoint, so it still kills a lot of people.
And Patrick, can you talk about where the Afghan war is at right now, heading into these multi-nation peace talks that are scheduled for next week? The Taliban has been gaining ground for many months now. The ISIS affiliate has lost territory. And meanwhile, you have President Trump in the U.S. considering sending a few thousand more American troops.
Yeah, it's kind of a stalemate, with the Taliban making gains on the ground. But they haven't taken any provincial capitals. And it's difficult for them to do that because they're going to come under air attack. They'll lose a lot of people. Islamic State, always much smaller out there in eastern Afghanistan, and have been losing quite a lot of territory recently. But overall, you could say, it's going somewhat in the direction of the Taliban. But they don't look like winning, nor do they look like losing. And both sides, it's not just, the Kabul government and the Afghan army against the Taliban. It's, they have their outside support. The Taliban essentially has always been very dependent on Pakistan and having sanctuaries in Pakistan. You have this enormous border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And right since the 90s, when the Taliban was started, that's always been their ace card, is to be able to come backwards and forwards from Pakistan. Of course, the Pakistanis deny this, but I think it's generally accepted as true. On the Afghan government side, they depend very much on the US and some other states, mostly on the US for weapons, for money, for finance. And again, that sort of helps keep them in a business. If Trump sends a few thousand more troops, is that going to really make much difference? Well, it'll make some, but it's not, the experience since 2001 is that this war doesn't end. You need to have negotiations, and you need to have all the parties there. Difficult to do, hasn't happened yet. No real sign of it happening.
Okay, on the point of Pakistan and the US, if it's true that Pakistani support for the Taliban, or at least elements of the Pakistani state support for the Taliban, is critical to keeping this war going, can the war be ended unless the US is willing to put pressure on its key ally, Pakistan?
I don't think so. I've never thought so. I started covering this war 2001, just after 9/11. I, like a lot of other people, knew that there was going to be a US-backed attack on Afghanistan, so I went there. But from a very early stage, it was pretty obvious that so long as the Taliban had Pakistan backing, it wasn't going to go out of business. Now, of course, it has got indigenous support inside Afghanistan in the Pashtun community, which is the largest community. But this Pakistani support is crucial. And this is, I think, what's so amazing, not just in Pakistan, but about the whole war on terror in so-called since 9/11 in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, is that they've, although it was obvious, even when there were very large numbers of American troops and British troops, for that matter, fighting in Afghanistan after 2006, unless they confronted Pakistan, they weren't going to win. But they never did that. They've always kept priority in retaining their alliances. I'm talking about the US and its allies, retaining their alliances with the big Sunni states like Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, the Gulf monarchies, or in the past, Turkey. Although that meant that they weren't going to beat the Taliban, they weren't going to beat Al-Qaeda, and for a long time, it wasn't likely they were going to beat ISIS. So there's been extraordinary contradiction in American policy, which never seems to have struck home in domestic politics, that they had a government which was sending big forces abroad, but in political circumstances, that whatever losses they inflicted, whatever losses they suffered, they couldn't win the war.
Hey, Patrick, can you talk to us a bit about the issue of blowback? It's well known that the forces that became the Taliban and Al-Qaeda were once supported by the US when they were fighting the Soviet occupation in the 70s and 80s. But specifically, the Haqqani network, which the Afghan government blames for this week's Kabul bombing, Haqqani network also, which is an offshoot of the Taliban, was nurtured and grown by the CIA.
Yeah, you have this sort of fatal and repeated circumstances, first in Afghanistan, later we saw it in Iraq and Libya and Syria, that you have local, what are now called Salafi jihadis, they're basically fundamentalists drawing on the Wahhabi version of Islam, which is prevalent in Saudi Arabia and Gaza, drawing on that tradition, a very fundamentalist, puritanical, and violent tradition, but to basically wage war on anybody who disagrees with them. People like that were used in Afghanistan against the Soviets, and later they were used against Gaddafi in Libya, and they were used by Saudi Arabia and the others initially in Syria. So there isn't, they're always the West and its local Sunni allies have been trying to use these guys and then finding that they're not just going to fight people who Saudi Arabia doesn't like, they're going to fight anybody that they don't like. So, it's pretty extraordinary, the war on terror, despite these billions and billions of dollars spent, the army sent overseas. Al-Qaeda used to be a small organization, time of 9/11. Now it's a very big organization. ISIS likewise.
Finally, Patrick, if you could comment on the state right now of Afghan civilians. Last year, according to the UN, was one of the worst, if not the worst, for Afghan civilians in terms of killings, casualties, and displacements. How the people of Afghanistan are faring right now?
Well, it was bad before, and it's getting worse. 500,000 people were displaced within their own country, turned into refugees within their own country last year. The number of civilians killed and wounded was about 11,000, which is higher in any year since 2009. So, it's going up. It's getting worse, not getting better.
Patrick Cockburn, Middle East correspondent for The Independent. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.